everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff. I'm your host, Sean Kneese. Today, I wanted to talk about getting over the need to be liked, or like getting over the fear of being disliked, which is something I still am working with, but I'm getting better at. And like I said in previous episodes, this isn't me being some kind of self-help guru and acting like I'm the enlightened ones who learned this and that. Like, I'm still very much on my own learning journey too. And when I talk about these are things I'm still kind of working out myself. But I feel like in sharing my experiences and things that have helped me and things that I'm learning, it can maybe help others too and start a dialogue too. You know, that's another good thing. The fear of being disliked, it's a natural one because, you know, humans are social animals. We are tribal creatures. We are very much like wolves, like how wolves are in packs, and sometimes there's the lone wolf, but even the lone wolf struggles, We all need other people on some level, even if we think we don't, I don't think anybody succeeds in life totally alone. You can develop a good relationship with yourself and you can come to count on yourself, but I think that being, having people you connect with is a necessity in life, at least for, I'd say, 99.9% of people. I don't want to speak for everybody. I hate it when people speak for everybody. I hate that in books too, when they're like, we do this, we do that, we do this, we do that, because sometimes I don't even do the stuff they say people do. But there's a balance, You got to stay true to yourself and express your truth and do what you feel is right. And in doing that, some people are not going to like you. If everybody likes you, you're just hiding who you are and just trying to please everybody, and that's not even achievable. There's no way everybody would ever like you, But that doesn't mean don't be considerate of others. That doesn't mean be a bad person to other people. That means just live your truth. And it'll resonate with some people and it won't with others. And another thing I thought of is like how, sometimes people, if they're bullied in high school or if they weren't liked in a certain point in their life, they'll say things like, I'm going to be a famous singer, so they'll all see. But it's like, if you didn't like somebody and all of a sudden you see them on the TV, they're a famous singer, would you be like, oh, maybe I was wrong about that person, they're a famous singer now? Or would you be like, oh, God, it's that asshole, now they're on TV too? I mean, your view wouldn't change them, right? So, like, the people that don't like you aren't going to like you. And I think I saw somewhere that Janis Joplin went through something similar. Like, she was picked on in high school. She was like the outcast. And she went back when she was a famous singer to her town, and everybody just treated her like the freak still, the outcast still. So if you're choosing a dream, it needs to be because it's something you want to pursue, not, for other people's approval or other people's validation. Because in the end, the people who like you and the people who care are going to be there, and the people who don't like you aren't going to like you. People who are there for you might encourage you to be a better version of yourself, but at the same time, they'll always appreciate you for who you are. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't sometimes be flaws you need to work on that push people away, that maybe if you work on them, it would help you connect with more people. But I'm just saying, like, in the end, there's going to be people that resonate with you, and there's going to be people you resonate with that where your path and your ways resonate with them, and others it won't vibe with, But at the end of the day, you got to do things your way. And doing things your way doesn't mean ignoring advice or never growing. It means filtering what you take in. I think sometimes people confuse living your truth with never changing. But honestly, growth is a part of living authentically. If you're growing and learning, that is your truth evolving. The tricky part is balancing this, being open to growth, but not changing just to fit someone else's mold. I think of it like this. You're the one who has to live with yourself every day. You're the one who has to wake up in your skin with your choices. So are you doing things that feel right to you, or are you doing things to avoid being disliked, criticized, or judged? I know it's hard to sit with that discomfort when someone doesn't like you. It's like this primal instinct kicks in and your brain says, fix it, make them like you. Fix it, make them like you. But I've realized, and maybe you have too, that chasing approval is like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The more you chase it, the emptier you feel because it's never enough. And honestly, some of the most impactful people in history weren't universally liked. They ruffled feathers. They challenged norms. They spoke truths that made people uncomfortable. And that discomfort, that's where growth happens. Not just for them, but for the world around them. So here's what I'm learning to do. Instead of asking, do they like me? I ask, am I proud of how I showed up? If the answer is yes, then that's a win. If the answer is no, then I reflect on what I need to adjust, not to make someone like me, but to make sure I'm aligned with who I want to be. And here's another thought. What if being disliked by some people is actually a sign that you're doing something right? I mean, think about it. If everyone agrees with you, are you really standing for anything? Are you really being yourself? I'm still working on this. I'm not here to pretend I've got it all figured out. There are days when I still catch myself overthinking something I said or wondering if I should have done something differently to make someone like me more. But those moments are becoming fewer. And when they happen, I remind myself I'm not for everyone. And that's okay. So to anyone listening who struggles with this too, I want to ask, what would your life look like if you stopped worrying about being liked? If you fully leaned into your truth, even if it meant some people didn't vibe with you? Is a scary thought, but it's also kind of freeing, right? I think also the fear of being disliked, I think there's a difference between that and not caring about being disliked and being inconsiderate of others. I think you should still be considerate of others. I think you could be considerate of others and still stay true to your core, your values, and assert yourself and set boundaries. Recently I was listening to the audiobook by Dr. Gabor Maté called The Myth of Normal. And that's fitting to this because what he was talking about is like how trauma conditions us to seek approval. And trauma, a lot of people associate trauma with the extreme example, which is like trauma due to a violent event or abuse, but trauma could also be stuff we didn't experience, certain areas where we didn't get validation. What were some, maybe some experiences in your childhood that you wish you had, maybe that you wish you had certain validations about certain parts of yourself that you didn't get, or maybe you feel like you missed out on experiences that other people during that time, like in the younger time, missed out on. And your trauma is the fact that you know, sometimes trauma could be what you didn't have, or the validation you didn't have, or the connection you didn't have. Like if you didn't have a strong like role model, or if you didn't or it could also be like a more minor thing, like if somebody was bullied when they were younger, if somebody had a moment that like really embarrassed them, like that they might not want to experience that again. So like trauma doesn't necessarily mean, like in its extreme, it's abuse and it's violence, but it can also mean, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, because there's, just so you can be aware of that too, like the more minor things that might not be as obvious that can shape your conditioning and how you respond to others. And just to give a bit of my experience, when I was younger, I didn't exactly develop as fast as a lot of my peers. Some of that might have been because I had a traumatic birth. I actually almost died at birth. But whatever, I was diagnosed with all these different things. ADHD. It used to be called Asperger's syndrome. Now it's called autism spectrum disorder. But I don't really know I think that might have been a misdiagnosis, because I have maybe certain things that fall in that realm, but I know I'm neurodivergent, like, because that can encompass a wide range. But this I've been diagnosed with different things, also OCD. But I try not to pay too much attention to the labels anymore. But anyway, because of that, I sometimes used to draw negative attention to myself, and I would sometimes be singled out for bullying because people thought, this guy's a little strange, he's an easy target to just pick on, blah, blah, blah. And I think later on, like some of my not wanting to speak my mind or wanting to kind of walk on eggshells and not say anything too controversial, which is held me back in some of the pursuits I have, as a podcaster, as an actor, just as a creative in general. You gotta be prepared for people to give you harsh criticism and say harsh things. I think it's just I've been getting beyond that, but I think a lot of that was just not wanting to be that person anymore, not wanting to think that I'm still that person I was when I was younger and that I'm somebody different now. And I know that that's like a mild experience compared to like somebody who went through like something horrific and has trauma because of that. And I know people who've done like incredible things, but like who've been through like horrible things. But I'm just saying, like, that was something about myself I had to understand, not judge, so I could get beyond it. Now, you can't necessarily control what thought comes in your head, and you can't necessarily control, but as like Dr. Gabor Maté was talking about trauma in this book, which I recommend, the Myth of Normal. He was talking about some like an experience that happened when he was younger. I know he was a Holocaust survivor and there was something when his wife couldn't pick him up from the airport or something along those lines, that he just went into silence and wouldn't talk to her, and he was real upset by that. But then he had to come to realize that wasn't the thing that happened. It was an experience when he was young, when he felt like he was neglected or abandoned. So when there's something like that, it triggered those emotions and he acted in a certain way. And I think sometimes we get into the people pleasing because we want to avoid pain. We want to avoid being judged, or it relates to some kind of traumatic experience we don't want to relive. And he was also talking about how actually this inability to say no at times can be bad for our health. Like, if we don't ever put ourselves first, if we don't ever set boundaries, if we don't ever say, like, do what's convenient for us first, that can have health impacts, because we might be doing things that are stressful for us, and there's the stress because there's that unsaid no, right? There's that unsaid need that's not being met. I'll just give a goofy example because just to add a little levity, your friend wants to watch Garfield for like the 500th time. They come over and they want to watch Garfield again, the orange cat, and then you're just like, okay, I guess we could watch Garfield again, but it's like inside you, it's just like gnawing at you, like, why do I gotta watch Garfield for like the 500th time? I mean, he's a nice big orange cat, but I don't want to watch him every fucking time we hang out. We gotta watch Garfield. That's not the same as somebody asking you to consistently do something you're not comfortable with, or not respecting your boundaries. But either way, mental health and physical health are very connected. More connected than we always realize. And that's not good for your mental health to keep things in. That's not good for your mental health to not say no when you need to say no. Or, I guess even in other cases, not say yes when you need to say yes. Not assert yourself a take-it opportunity because of a people-pleasing mindset, So it's a challenge learning to recognize when we're falling into that pattern and catching ourselves before it goes too far. Because sometimes it's not as obvious as watching Garfield for the 500th time. Sometimes it's saying yes to extra work when we're already overwhelmed. Sometimes it's staying silent when someone crosses a boundary. Sometimes it's agreeing to plans we don't have the energy for, just because we don't want to disappoint someone. And over time, these small sacrifices add up. The stress of constantly overriding your own needs doesn't just stay in our minds, it embeds itself in our bodies. Chronic stress, tension, even autoimmune disorders there's evidence that long-term emotional suppression can manifest physically. So it's not just about avoiding discomfort in the moment, it's about protecting our long-term well-being. But breaking that habit takes work. It takes being uncomfortable. It takes sitting with the guilt that might come up when you finally say no and realizing that guilt isn't a sign you're doing something wrong, it's a sign that you're doing something new. That you're unlearning patterns that no longer serve you. And at the end of the day, people who truly care about you, who actually respect you, won't disappear just because you start setting boundaries. If someone only sticks around because you're constantly accommodating them, that's not a real connection. Real relationships, whether friendships, family, or anything else, shouldn't require you to erase yourself. So if saying no feels hard, start small. Say no to Garfield first, then work your way up. People-pleasing is a deeply ingrained behavior that can have significant impacts on mental health, relationships, and personal fulfillment, as we've been discussing. While the desire to be liked and accepted is natural, chronic people-pleasing often leads to self-neglect, resentment, and burnout. The key to overcoming this pattern lies in understanding its roots, like we discussed, recognizing its manifestations, and implementing strategies to cultivate self-worth and assertiveness. So one of the most notable traits of people-pleasing, and we've discussed this, but I'm trying to... Sometimes a little repetition is good just to reinforce a point, but it's difficulty in setting boundaries. Saying no often feels impossible, leading to an overload of commitments and eventual exhaustion. This inability to decline requests stems from a deep-seated fear of rejection or disappointing others. Additionally, excessive apologizing becomes a habitual response, even in situations where no fault exists. This behavior reinforces the idea that one must always maintain harmony, even at a personal expense. Submissive tendencies are also common among people-pleasers. They frequently suppress their own opinions and desires to align with others, leading to a gradual erosion of personal identity. When one's sense of self becomes defined by external validation, a cycle of self-doubt and insecurity takes hold. Seeking approval becomes a primary motivation, seeking an ongoing dependency on the reassurance of others. People-pleasing tendencies often originate from childhood experiences. Individuals raised in environments where love was conditional, based on achievements or compliance, may develop a habit of prioritizing others' expectations over their own needs. Similarly, children with emotionally unavailable or critical parents may learn to suppress their own desires to gain approval and avoid conflict. Cultural and societal influences further reinforce these tendencies, particularly in communities that emphasize selflessness and agreeableness. Many are taught that prioritizing personal well-being is selfish, leading to guilt when attempting to establish boundaries. In reality, maintaining healthy boundaries is essential for sustaining genuine and fulfilling relationships. While people-pleasers aim to create harmony, the reality is often the opposite. Constantly accommodating others leads to increased stress, anxiety, and eventual emotional exhaustion. The pressure to meet expectations and avoid conflict can manifest physically through chronic fatigue, headaches, and digestive issues. In relationships, excessive people-pleasing fosters codependency, where one partner relies on the other's validation while the other grows accustomed to being prioritized. This imbalance can prevent authentic emotional connections and hinder personal growth. Over time, the suppression of personal needs and emotions results in frustration, resentment, and a diminished sense of self-worth. So overcoming people-pleasing requires intentional effort, but the transformation is entirely possible. This journey begins with self-awareness, identifying patterns and understanding the underlying fears driving these behaviors. Keeping a journal to track instances of people-pleasing can provide valuable insights and help recognize emotional triggers. Setting boundaries. As we discussed, learning to say no is an essential skill. It may feel uncomfortable initially, but recognizing that declining a request does not equate to rejection is crucial. And rejection isn't the worst thing in the world either. It's something you need to learn. It's something I'm learning too. But when I say you, I'm including myself too. But small steps such as pausing before immediately agreeing to something can help build confidence in boundary setting. So practicing assertiveness, communicating needs and opinions respectfully and confidently is key to breaking the cycle of excessive accommodation. Assertiveness does not mean aggression. Rather, it involves expressing thoughts and preferences while respecting others. That's the middle ground I've always been trying to find, because I've had times where I blow up, and I've had times where I don't say what I think and I'm too passive, and that middle ground is something I'm trying to navigate more. And I'm learning to navigate more, especially with the older I get to, the more laid back I become about things, and the more I know myself. So building self-esteem is another key thing that's important to this. Shifting self-worth from external validation to internal confidence is fundamental. Engaging in activities that foster a sense of personal fulfillment rather than seeking approval helps reinforce self-identity. Challenging negative self-talk and practicing self-compassion can aid in this transformation. Also, seeking professional support. Therapy can be beneficial in uncovering deep-seated fears and addressing past trauma that contributes to people-pleasing tendencies. A professional can guide individuals in developing healthier coping mechanisms and strategies for establishing balanced relationships. And you can work out these things yourself, but I think a good therapist, because there's a lot of quacks out there, but a good therapist can help you understand the root of these things. And sometimes it's things you don't even remember or think of that, or the reasons you've gotten certain patterns. But also embracing authenticity, I wanted to talk about. That's important too. Breaking free from people-pleasing is not about disregarding kindness or empathy, as we discussed. It's about balancing compassion for others with self-respect. Authentic relationships are built on mutual understanding and respect, not on constant self-sacrifice. While some relationships may change or fade during this transformation, those that remain will be stronger and more fulfilling. I just thought of another thing. Like if you're surrounded by a bunch of people that don't align with your values, and just in many different ways, they don't align with your values and their beliefs and their lifestyle and just the way they. I mean, I'm not saying you have to. Your friends all have to be like you, but if the way they are doesn't align with your values, that's a sign that you aren't asserting your own boundaries and you aren't solid in what you believe. You aren't expressing what you believe and your truth enough. Because you're more people pleasing. You want people to like you. You want to have friends, even if the friends don't align with who you are and what your values are. Or even you want to be in a relationship and you're with somebody whose values don't align with yours, or doesn't really fulfill you because you're not asserting what you want and your boundaries. And as individuals begin to prioritize their well-being, they may experience a mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, or even guilt. And that book I was talking about earlier, Dr. Gabor Maté, talks about that guilt of saying no. There's also a good assertiveness book that I've talked about from Manuel J. Smith called "When I Say No, I Feel Guilty." I talked about that in another episode that was specifically on assertiveness. This is more about overcoming people pleasing and being okay with being disliked. But with time and practice, the discomfort will lessen, making room for a more fulfilling and authentic existence. True self-worth comes from within, and embracing one's genuine self ultimately leads to deeper connections and a more satisfying life. So, I think a good thing to also remember is that our time here is limited and we're eventually going to die, so you're meant to be on this earth to speak your truth, and whatever discomfort comes from what other people think when you speak your truth won't compare to the regret you'll feel on your deathbed when you realize you didn't live a life true to yourself. When you realize you didn't express yourself, you weren't authentic, and that you didn't stand for what you believed, you didn't live the life you wanted to. That I think that feeling is worse than anything. Like when you're in your last moments, you realize you didn't do that. I think you just got to remember that that's going to be a lot worse than whatever discomfort comes from some person that you thought was your friend not being your friend anymore, or some idiot saying a couple harsh words, or in the end, all of that's just going to be faint memories in the distance, and you'll be remembered better by others for being someone who stood for what you knew. I'm going to say knew was right because it's a knowing. I don't know. You're someone who stood for what they believed in. You're someone who went after what they want. You're somebody, etc., etc. I'm just saying the same thing in different ways, but it's about thinking about the long term rather than just the short term, because that short term discomfort can lead to a long term peace. The journey to reclaiming authenticity starts with a single step, whether it's saying no to an overwhelming request or speaking up about a personal preference. Each small act of self-assertion paves the way for a healthier, more balanced future. You deserve to live a life that aligns with your true self, free of the weight of others' expectations. Okay, so before we wrap up, I did want to talk about one other book that I think would be helpful. It's called The Courage to be Disliked, the Japanese Phenomenon that shows you how to change your life and achieve real happiness. It's by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga. I'm hoping I pronounced those names right. My apologies if I didn't. And I recommend getting the audiobook because, depending on what book it is, I like to read a physical or I like to read an audiobook. But I think this is good for the audiobook because it has a couple of people reading different lines of the book. It has a British guy being like the teacher, and then it has this younger voice being like the guy who's asking him the questions about life, and he's telling him. It makes for an entertaining presentation of it. But one of the main things the book teaches kind of relates to what I was saying before about trauma or your past experiences determining how you see your future, like past failures or past things didn't go well. It's hard to think that you'll have a different or better outcome in the future. So one of the main points is it's dangerous to believe that your past determines your future. Also, if you focus on what's wrong with you, you might be looking for reasons to hate yourself on purpose. Because you could probably, with people you really like and admire in your life, you could probably, if you wanted to, find things about them you don't like, and you could just focus and dwell on those. When you're so focused on looking at your negative or things you did wrong, you're not looking at what you did right. And I think the more you look at what you did right and the more you look at your good qualities, the more those good qualities grow and evolve. And also another main point is most of what we think is competition is just made up and hurting our happiness. That's another main point. I guess there is somewhat of a need for competition in this world we live in, but I think at the same time, I think it's more about, I don't think your success, if you're really living your truth, is going to look like other people's success. And sometimes success to you isn't what other people view as success. Like, what makes you truly happy and fulfilled might not be the typical society view of what success is, you know? So, in short, the book is an analysis from two Japanese authors on the teachings of Alfred Adler, who said that happiness is in the hands of each individual and not dependent on external validation or past traumas. And the reason why I think this philosophy isn't as common, like people don't live by this as commonly, is because, you know, in psychology, it's more dominated by like Sigmund Freud, who always focused on how trauma shapes us, how our childhood shapes us. But Adler was more about how we don't need to be like that. We can change. And that's the main point the book talks about. So here's a quote from the book from Ichiro Kishimi. It says, "The courage to be happy also includes the courage to be disliked. When you have gained that courage, your interpersonal relationships will all at once change into things of lightness." And I think ironically then more people will like you because you're being authentic and you're saying things that resonate with them. You're not just walking on eggshells to please them. But so I would recommend these two books I've discussed, and they kind of overlap and talk about similar things, only I would say Dr. Gabor Maté is more like empirical and research based with this book, like different studies and interviews, and The Courage to be Disliked is more like listening to a spiritual book almost. It's more just direct and straightforward. I hope you've gained some insight in how to break free from the grip of people-pleasing and start living authentically. Remember, you deserve to prioritize your own needs and set boundaries that serve you. It's not about being selfish, it's about being true to yourself. And that actually was one more point I meant to make, is that I think that's why you see a lot of mean or inconsiderate or insensitive people kind of dominating, and ignorant people dominating too, because without going into specifics, because I don't want to get like too divisive for this episode, because this is more of a universal point, but when people say things in a very opinionated way, even if they're ignorant and don't know what the hell they're talking about, it draws people because they're drawn to that just kind of quick way of saying things. But actually, I think when you're more intelligent and you actually know things are going on, there's more questions and there's more nuance, and you're not always as like quick to just be so sure that you're right about this. But I think it's a balance, because I think it is good to, like, if you know something's wrong and you want to speak out on it, or you want to stand for your values, or you want to assert yourself in any kind of way, I think just be firm in that, even if you don't have all the answers, even if you don't know, because I would like to see more empowered, kind, and smart people. I think that there isn't enough of those, because when you're kind and you're empathetic, you're going to try to do things that accommodate other people, which I think is necessary to a degree. You can't be totally inconsiderate of people and just shit on others. You gotta be empathetic, but that shouldn't be at the expense of your needs. That's where the problem comes, is when it's the expense of your own needs, and knowing when to put yourself first, and also asserting your boundaries, your values, knowing what you stand for, expressing your authentic self without fear of rejection. Like, I think as long as you're not infringing on other people with your actions, if it makes you happy and it feels right to you, you shouldn't have to explain yourself, even though if other people don't like it. As long as, I guess the way I look at it is, your rights end where another's begin. So I think as long as you're not hurting anybody, do what feels right to you. So anyway, that's about it for this episode. If you want to keep updated with future episodes of Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast. You can also follow me on social media. Let's Talk About the Deep Stuff to stay connected. And that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.